Please note this podcast discusses real-life crimes and may include sensitive topics such as violence, abuse, and other disturbing content. We recommend listener discretion.
Identification was going to be a real challenge. We have specialist teams of officers in that situation, but the number of body parts we were dealing with from the trauma that was caused to those victims brought significant challenge. We were dealing with in excess of 1,000 body parts.
I'm journalist Helen Fospero.
I'm crime reporter Martin Brunt.
And this is True Criminals.
A journey into the darkest corners of the criminal underworld with insights from decades of true crime reporting.
The stories behind the stories, plus exclusive interviews with those closely involved in notorious cases.
Re-examining crimes so shocking, they still haunt our imaginations.
London, July the 7th, 2005, 7/7. 4 suicide bombers on public transport killed 52 people, left 700 people injured, many of them with life-changing injuries, and left a city shattered. But the terror didn't end there. Days later, the capital faced another wave of chaos. In this second episode, marking the 20th anniversary of the London bombings, we'll talk more to Chris Webb, former head of news and deputy director of media and communications at the Metropolitan Police Service, who orchestrated unprecedented media access during the crisis. This is the story of what happened after the bombs exploded, the hunt for the killer's accomplices, the second wave of attacks 2 weeks later on July the 21st, and the shooting of electrician John Charles de Menezes, tragically mistaken by police for a terrorist. Martin, it's well documented what happened on July the 7th. The days that followed, though, are less familiar, but equally as chaotic. What was your experience as a reporter like in those weeks after the initial attacks?
After the initial horror, the shock, the drama of those rescue operations and the incredible survivor stories, I guess the pressure was relentless. Remember, this was the heyday of 24-hour rolling news, and the 24-hour news cycle demanded updates on the investigation. So during those frantic weeks, I virtually lived on the pavement outside Scotland Yard, certainly for most waking hours. When I did go to bed, it was in the hotel opposite Scotland Yard.
I remember at 5 News I presented some of our programmes live from Trafalgar Square, and there was a sense we needed to come out of the comfort of the studio and somehow be seen in the heart of London.
Well, I was used to reporting on the street, but not so continuously. Our audience figures shot up, and I suppose I must have become a familiar face to many viewers.
Chris, let's bring you back into the conversation. Welcome back to True Criminals. As someone who helped shape the police response to 7/7 and deal with the aftermath, I'm guessing this must have been one of the most intense periods of your working life to date.
Indeed it was. You've got to bear in mind that 7 months before the 7th of July bombings, we had just dealt with the Asian tsunami, the Boxing Day tsunami, and I found myself leading the media and communication response to support the Met activity. So 7 months on, we now find ourselves again facing unprecedented demand in dealing with the biggest terror attack to happen on UK soil since the Lockerbie air crash.
Martin was saying he was virtually camped outside of Scotland Yard, but you had endless briefings and statements and press conferences during that period, didn't you?
So between the 7th of July and the 1st of August, we dealt with 8,000 media inquiries. We issued 200 press statements and we gave 25 press conferences. Most of those press conferences were at the Queen Elizabeth Conference Centre. So we had not just national but international media attention, and we had to cater for that as well. As the UK was going to sleep, Australia and America was waking up. So we had to respond to that and put in place a 24/7 media operation to cater for that intense demand.
This is where I'm guessing, Martin, your relationships that you developed and nurtured over the years with people like Chris come into play, because there was also an informal side to this from your point of view as a reporter, wasn't there?
Indeed. As a member of the Crime Reporters Association, I and others got private sessions with Assistant Commissioner Andy Hayman. He was the man running the show. He was tight-lipped, especially about the bombers' identities to begin with, but we felt that he wanted to share what he could. Now, detectives obviously suspected suicide missions, but they wouldn't confirm it, or they couldn't confirm it at the start. They were in touch with the bombers' families, but were having to treat them as bereaved relatives and also potential suspects who could have been part of a wider conspiracy. Chris, I remember we often harangued Andy Hayman and you for more information. Why couldn't you tell us earlier that these were suicide bombers?
I've been involved with a number of high-profile investigations, and I was always taught you follow the evidence. Whilst I appreciate the demands that the media were putting on us to actually confirm, and I appreciate it was several days before we were able to confirm that they were suicide bombers, it's about following that evidence. Because if we'd got that wrong, imagine the damage that would have been done on the Metropolitan Police Service. So we had to be confident that what we were saying was based on fact and evidence.
Chris, tell us a bit about the conversations that you were having with the bombers' families, because presumably they're grieving, but were they also suspects?
You don't know whether they had any knowledge of the intention of their loved ones. So, yes, you have to treat them as bereaved relatives, but they also actually are mindful that they might become a suspect. And one thing that policing is very good at, it will put in place something called family liaison officers. And they are skilled officers that engage with bereaved families, with conventional deaths, but also on mass fatality incidents like this. So this is about following the evidence. Yes, families were grieving as suspects, but we had to interview them without tipping off their wider networks or making them aware of the evidence that we had. So we had a good indication of who they were, but what we didn't understand was if there was wider involvement from other family members at that point.
Very difficult times, and I'm guessing, Martin, as a reporter on a live rolling news channel, these are exactly the kind of new developments and information that you're trying to tease out of people like Chris and his colleagues to get the news out to the public before other broadcasters do.
Part of my job as the specialist crime reporter is to find things that other reporters don't know. I suppose we're all after scoops. And sometimes my efforts to do that weren't very dignified. On my pavement spot outside Scotland Yard, I badgered senior officers whenever I saw them. People walking in and out, I'd rush over, if I wasn't broadcasting at the time, and just ask them if they knew about this or that, or did they know anything. Most times I got nothing. Occasionally, Dick Fedorcio, the Met's press chief and Chris's boss, gave impromptu updates on the pavement. And that showed you how quickly things were moving. And I remember once I was live on air when Fedorcio started talking to a huddle of reporters behind me. I paused, turned, and I said to the presenter, look, hang on a minute, I might have an update for you. I turned round, listened in to what was being said very briefly, then turned back to the camera and repeated what I'd just been told. Now, that must have looked quite messy, a bit rough around the edges, but at least our viewers got breaking news in real time. When other journalists complained about the privileged access that we were getting as members of the Crime Reporters Association, Chris hatched a plan. Every night we'd meet him and Assistant Commissioner Hayman in a corner of the nearby Sanctuary pub. There they would share intelligence off the record, ensuring that we didn't derail undercover operations. And in return, we got a rare window into the investigation as it unfolded. Now, some of the information we could use, and I recall one night I slipped out of the pub 3 times to deliver live updates into the Sky News programme.
That just sounds like a plan you might hatch, Chris, a briefing in the pub. But just explain why Scotland Yard decided to share so much information with the press, and particularly with colleagues that you really trusted and knew would handle the information sensitively.
To be quite honest, I don't know why we ended up in the pub. And but we had the official press conferences that were being done daily at the QE2 Conference Centre. And there was lots of media, both national and international media, hanging about outside New Scotland Yard. I talked earlier about controlling the narrative, and it's really important with a fast-moving investigation that you actually do that, but you do that with people that you trust. And the Crime Reporters Association is a body of people that the police has a really good relationship with. So having spoken to Andy Heyman and chatted this through with him, we agreed that we would keep the CRA, the Crime Reporters Association, appraised of major developments in the investigation as things progressed. And then there was a reason for doing that. We knew that the news desk and news editors were putting considerable pressure on reporters for scoops or the latest information. And at that time, we had a very complex investigation and operation that was being undertaken that was both overt and covert. The last thing we wanted was for journalists to stumble into an area and compromise that covert operation. So it was about that two-way engagement, treating the media as stakeholders and actually sharing with them as much as we possibly could, both on and off the record. And trust was fundamental to that. The reporters needed to trust what we were saying, and we also had to trust that the reporters were not going to use information that we did not want used at that point.
Also, after 9/11 and Madrid, suicide bombings were a new threat to the UK. What was going on behind the scenes with your thinking on that? Because presumably the public needed to have some kind of understanding as to what we're all dealing with as a nation.
Absolutely right. The learning from an operational perspective completely changed after the terrible terrorism atrocities that had occurred in America and Madrid. Also, Mumbai was very much in the back of our minds as well, and the atrocities that happened in Mumbai. So from an operational perspective, there had to be new rules of engagement for dealing with that threat and that possibility of those suicide bomb attacks.
My feeling at the time, Chris, was that there was another reason why you were perhaps freer with information, you and Assistant Commissioner Heyman, than you might otherwise have been. And it's this, that even though perhaps it took you a while to establish they were suicide bombers and they were British, the idea that there was this new enemy within was something that the public needed to know about as far as you could. Ordinarily, after an occasion like this, we have to wait the end of the investigation and a trial that might be 2 years away. Now, that's an awful long time for people to wait to really understand the threat that they were facing at the time. And I think, tell me if I'm wrong, but you and Andy Heyman came to a conclusion that the public had a right to know there was this new enemy from within.
You're absolutely right, Martin. For the first time, we had faced people that were willing to blow themselves up for their cause. And that changed the dynamics. And it was important that we actually shared as much information about that new threat that we actually face, so that the public continue to have confidence in policing. And if we hadn't done that, there would have been all kinds of speculation. And it was been then trying to manage that speculation, that misinformation. So a decision was made that we would be on the front foot and that we would share as much information as we possibly could to actually shape the narrative and to provide that public confidence and that public reassurance.
One question haunted families. How many people died? Why did it take days, really, Chris, to confirm the final death toll?
What people do not appreciate is, with something like what we dealt with on the 7th of July, is the level of trauma that was caused to those who sadly lost their lives. And identification was going to be a real challenge. We have teams of officers that are deployed, specialist teams of officers in that situation. But the number of body parts we were dealing with from the trauma that was caused to those victims brought significant challenge. We were dealing with in excess of 1,000 body parts. So you can imagine it was not possible to identify the majority of victims as quickly as we would like. Such was the challenge that we had to set up a temporary mortuary at the Honourable Artillery Company in the City of London, specifically so that we could do that analysis and we could understand through DNA and other scientific evidence who those body parts belong to. So that was massive. It was a massive challenge, and we could not give the families who were grieving or concerned about their loved ones, we could not give them the reassurance that they actually sought.
Chris, I'm sure you'll remember this day. There was a press conference with Jim Dickey, who we both knew very well, experienced murder detective. He was detective superintendent at the time, but his job in the wake of 7/7 was as senior identity manager. And we were picking up that relatives were getting very angry that people hadn't been identified. And there was a press conference at which Dickie tried to explain the forensic difficulties that you've alluded to. And he was describing limbs disconnected from torsos, even rats scavenging remains. I remember, Chris, you shut him down mid-press conference with a scribbled note which said, "Shut the fuck up." Can you talk us how that happened?
It's about making sure that it's no void or vacuum. And so I needed to understand where the vulnerabilities and risks were going to come from. And quite understandably, we picked up the families of the missing were getting frustrated that we were unable to confirm whether their loved ones were alive or dead. That started to generate some very negative media commentary. So from my perspective, we need to put some context around that. And you're right that Jim Dickie was the senior identification manager. He was leading the whole body recovery exercise. So I decided to put Jim up at a press conference to talk about the complexities with that body recovery operation. What I was not expecting and was not prepared for was the language that he was starting to use about dismembered body parts and rats nibbling on toes and things like that. So I wrote a note to him and passed it to him, basically saying, in very polite terms, "Please stop this."
Well, I've the cat's out of the bag.
Yeah, I think those four little words worked, I presumed.
But Jim was a very straight-talking, down-to-earth guy, wasn't he?
He was.
Which we appreciated in him. But he read the note, then what happened?
He stopped. He stopped.
Wouldn't you?
But we achieved what we wanted to achieve. Jim is a very experienced detective. He's used to dealing with high-profile investigations. You couldn't ask for anybody better than him to actually lead that part of the operation, the body recovery operation. So he was able to explain and put into context what we wanted to try and achieve, to try and give some reassurance to the families, but also to the wider public, that we weren't deliberately ignoring the families' concerns.
I think you told me at the time, or soon after that episode, that what you needed were facts, not horror stories from Jim. But it worked, because 4 days later, you had a total of 52 names, and that's where the death toll stopped.
Yep, there was great work being done not only by the officers looking after body recovery, but those looking after the casualty bureau. And within a few days, we were able to confirm the 52 people who had died. There was always the fear and concern that actually more might die because of the catastrophic injuries that they'd suffered.
2 weeks later, on July the 21st, London faced another crisis. Martin, what happened?
I was still outside doing live reports at Scotland Yard. The main story that morning was of a wave of arrests in Pakistan that were connected to the search for people who may have helped the original bombers. Then a wire dropped. Reuters reported explosions at Warren Street, Shepherd's Bush and Oval stations. Witnesses suddenly were describing a rucksack blowing up on a bus. No injuries. Police later confirmed failed bombs. What had happened was that 4 more bombers had tried to replicate 7/7 without the carnage. One suspect, a man with a charred shirt and wires hanging out, fled. Armed officers, we were told, stormed University College Hospital looking for him. Outside Downing Street, our camera caught a man being tackled by police. He was forced to strip and he was handcuffed and taken away. It just was, I suppose, an indication of how nervous everybody was. Our screen flashed a plea, send photos to Sky News. I think it was Scotland Yard who intervened in that. Within an hour, the message had shifted to send images to the police.
What are your recollections of the 21st, Chris?
I was actually having lunch in the office and I got an alert flash up from Transport for London and it said, does anyone know of an incident at Oval Underground Station, smoke coming from a train? That was about 1 o'clock. So I went into the press bureau and we were then starting to get reports coming in that a number of trains on the Underground looked like they'd been targeted. There were also reports coming in that at least one bus had been targeted. And I stopped dead in my tracks and I thought, please, no, here we go again. And we then put into place the plans that we successfully delivered on the 7th of July and then just started to push out press releases, engage with partners, talk to journalists about what we knew at that time.
And what about the decision presumably to call Sky and ask them to change the send photos to Sky News to say send images to police. What was the thinking behind that?
Well, unlike the 7th of July, we knew that we had terrorists on the run, and we needed as much information, as many images as possible to understand who those people were, to be able to identify them.
Within hours, we were saying on air that the bombers had botched it, that the bomb's detonators had gone off, but they hadn't ignited the bombs. But the Commissioner, Ian Blair, had to reassure the public and avert mass panic, if you like. Do you remember him going on air and talking in those terms?
I know that there was real concern. I actually found this much more difficult to deal with than the actual 7th of July in some circumstances, because on the 7th of July, we knew what we had. We had bombs go off on the transport network. All we knew from this was there had been pops, and people talked about a substance that was fizzing. And we actually had to deploy officers in full protective equipment as a precaution. My fear at this point was, is this some kind of biological attack? And the fact we were having to deploy officers in protective equipment, we actually confirmed that at 2:30, that we were deploying as a precaution officers in protective equipment, and people should not be alarmed, but remain where they are and await for further information.
I seem to remember by the end of that day, the 21st, it had become established that the bombs hadn't gone off. And my recollection is one of just enormous relief in the words that Ian Blair was using, and in fact, Tony Blair. In fact, Tony Blair gave a press conference from Downing Street, and he was hosting John Howard, the Australian Premier, and he said that people should just behave normally, the panic was over in a sense, and he was going back to his schedule of meetings. And I think what was missing in those public messages was something that I was aware of, and I'm sure you were, that there were 4 bombers on the loose who tried to blow up tubes and a bus and were quite likely to regroup with more bombs and do the same again.
Well, we knew we had 4 people on the run. What their future intentions were, we didn't know. There was obviously that concern that they would regroup because they had failed in their mission to carry out further atrocities on the transport network. And they had to be caught, and they had to be caught quickly. So if you look at that, the 21st of July, at 4:00 in the afternoon, we were able to confirm that there was no trace of any chemical substance in those devices that had gone off. And for me, that was really, really assuring that we were able to do that. But then the focus very much moved from the actual operational response to a manhunt.
And then, of course, Martin, came the tragedy at Stockwell Tube Station on July the 22nd, the day after. Tell us what happened at Stockwell.
Well, the manhunt for the failed bombers had been on for 24 hours. So the next day, the 22nd, I was back at my familiar spot outside Scotland Yard, very aware of the desperate hunt for these failed bombers. And I got a phone call from a guy I knew very well, Peter Rose, freelance crime reporter. Chris will remember him. And he simply said down the phone, they've shot one of the bombers at Stockwell. Well, that was momentous news, but not the sort of thing I could rush on air with immediately. I thought, I need to make sure I don't get this wrong, so I need some kind of corroboration. Well, while I was thinking about what I was going to do, I looked across at the other reporters on the pavement, and they certainly didn't seem to be aware of what had happened, if it had happened. And then while I was trying to work out what I was going to do with this information, a detective I knew from the flying squad wandered past me and almost without breaking his stride whispered to me, a rather loud whisper, "We've just shot one of the suicide bombers at Stockwell." Well, that was enough for me. That was corroboration. I went on the air and I broke the story, and moments later my rivals were scrambling to verify it. I could almost sense while I was breaking this news my rivals stopping talking and chattering behind me and leaning in to hear what I was saying. It's one of those great moments where you kind of think, thank God for, as a journalist, for keeping up and keeping in contact with your contacts. But then things began to get very complicated. The police initially claimed that the suspect had jumped a barrier and had ignored shouts to stop from police and was directly linked to the events the day before, the 21/7 failed bombers. But that was wrong information. By the next day, they admitted that the man who'd been shot wasn't a bomber. He was an electrician, a Brazilian, 27-year-old John Charles de Menezes. He'd been mistaken for a terrorist. It was a catastrophic failure. Poor communications, panic, and a rush to judgment amid fears of another terror attack. Sir Ian Blair later called him the 53rd victim of the attackers, and that episode certainly blighted Sir Ian's career.
Chris, I'm sure this loomed very large in your day. What are your memories of that day and what had happened?
It actually doesn't, because I'd taken a long weekend off. I hadn't had a weekend off since the end of June, because the last weekend of June we were planning for the Olympics announcement, and then we had the 7th of July. So this was my first weekend off that I'd actually booked. And my boss, Dick Fedorcio, said, take a long weekend. So once we had the events of the 21st of July, I said to Dick, I'll cancel my leave. And he said, no, you haven't had a decent break. You need to have some time out. So I wasn't actually at Scotland Yard on the 22nd. About 11 o'clock, I had a call at home from a senior colleague in the department saying, we shot one of the bombers. Now, the last thing you want is somebody interfering. Actually, it's not on duty. So I left them to it. But then I had to go back in on the Monday and then pick up the pieces from what came out that weekend that we had tragically shot an innocent member of the public.
What was that fallout like for you? Because it was such a horrific moment, wasn't it? For you in your role to pick up the pieces, what did that involve?
Well, we had killed an innocent man, and there's no getting away from that. I reviewed what statements had gone out on the Friday and over the weekend, and I thought some of those actually left the Met in a very difficult position because of what had been said. So again, it was trying to actually set some context around that, making sure that what we were saying there was factually accurate based on evidence. But you've got to bear in mind, not only had we shot an innocent member of the public, we were still looking for 4 bombers that obviously were prepared to actually blow themselves up to cause a catastrophic incident again on the transport network. So for me, there was a twin-track approach, dealing with the tragedy of John Charles de Menezes and the fallout from that, but also supporting the operation and investigation to find the foul bombers from the 21st of July.
And also there was real public nervousness as well, because they were still on the run. And I think particularly people in London, where the tube network is, were really nervous. But from your perspective, Martin, that weekend, obviously Chris was away taking a well-earned break. What was your experience of how Scotland Yard handled the fallout in those initial hours and days?
Well, initially they handled it very badly. That line that the suspect had jumped the barrier was maintained until the evidence emerged that forced a retraction. And the public were furious when it emerged that he was an innocent man. And that's to say nothing, of course, of the horror and the impact on Jean-Charles de Menezes' distraught family. It really was one of the bleakest days in the Met's history.
Do you think it was, Chris?
I think it was one of the most difficult. The Met has a history of facing difficult situations in its history. I definitely think it's at the top end of those.
Despite the chaos, police did close in over those next few days on the bombers' network. How did it end?
Well, the story continued to dominate our news bulletins every day. There was no real let-up. During those next few days, I was supposed to be packing for a foreign holiday, but the manhunt kept me glued to the pavement at Scotland Yard. So we came to the 29th of July, when arrests were being made. 2 days before that, 27th of July, Yassin Omar, one of those bombers whose bomb failed to go off on the 21st of July, was caught in Birmingham. It subsequently emerged that he'd fled London disguised in a burqa. So he proved to be quite a resourceful guy. Then on that 29th of July, we had a call into the Sky News office from a woman in West London who told us that there was an awful lot of police activity outside her building. In fact, there were dozens of police cars, ambulances and fire engine vehicles, and there were police getting ready for what she thought was some kind of raid. And the good news for us was that she not only could describe what was happening, but would let us in to see it ourselves. So she allowed a camera to go into her flat, and that was set up and started broadcasting live. I remember I suddenly got a phone call from Assistant Commissioner Andy Heyman, who essentially begged us to stop broadcasting live, because at one point we were showing firearms officers putting on full body armour, which could only have been the prelude to a raid on the flat. And it seemed clear that this was connected to the hunt for the failed bombers. Andy Heyman wouldn't tell me that, but I think he said enough, or didn't say enough, to reinforce the idea that this might be the end game, and who knows how it was going to end. But his concern was that if the bombers were inside that flat watching Sky News and seeing the police getting ready for a raid, they might be tempted, if they had a bomb, to blow it up and take the building and some of those people who were in the process of being evacuated with them. But we paused, we stopped the live shots, the raid went ahead, and after a standoff that lasted, I think, about 2 hours, the police arrested Mukhtar Saeed Ibrahim and Ramzi Mohammed. So 2 more of the 21st of July failed bombers. They surrendered in their underwear. They were filmed walking out with their hands raised in their underpants.
Not only was Martin getting calls from senior officers in the Met, but so was I. And I had a very angry call from Peter Clark, who was the head of counter-terrorism at the time, about the real risk to this operation if the media broadcast live images of officers putting on equipment, getting ready to actually storm the premises. And the other thing was, because of where the flat was situated, where the bombers were located, we could not evacuate the whole block. We could evacuate the floors underneath and the floors above. But the actual floor where the bombers were situated, we could not evacuate the premises either side of that. So there was real fear that they could see something being broadcast live on television, and if they had access to explosives, they would detonate those explosives. So we had something called a kidnap agreement, which would allow us to ask for a news blackout so that operations weren't compromised. So I invoked that. I personally spoke to all news editors from the main UK broadcasters and asked them not to broadcast live images. I said, I'm quite happy for you to continue filming, but please do not broadcast any of those images until I have said to you it is safe to do so. And every one of those broadcasters, without fail, agreed to do that.
And did that operation end safely? Nobody else was injured or anything like that in the process?
Yes. The footage that comes out afterwards, you see the stun grenades, the tear gas being fired into the flat where the bombers were located. And then you see the 2 bombers, Mukhtar Ibrahim and Ramzi Mohammed, stagger out with that, wiping the tear gas from their eyes. They were asked to remove all their clothing. And you see them coming out and put their hands up and surrender to police.
Hours later, the 4th bomber, Hussein Osman, was caught in Rome. It had been the biggest police operation in British history. And of course, it was far from over. But essentially, the 4 bombers on the loose had been held. And finally, I could leave the pavement outside Scotland Yard.
I'm guessing you're fairly relieved to leave the pavement outside Scotland Yard after the 2 weeks of reporting that you'd gone through, Martin. I think Tony Blair, Prime Minister at the time, declared after 7/7 that the rules of the game have changed. What did that mean in practice?
It meant new counter-terror laws. It meant wider surveillance of more potential suspects. Anti-terror measures were essentially rushed through Parliament. The government feared more attacks, and of course, there were more as the years went on.
Chris, how do you look back now? It's been 20 years at the unprecedented media access you supervised and, well, that you were an architect of, really, in that frantic month of July 2005.
Despite the death of John Charles de Menezes, I actually look back with a sense of pride. The fact that we learnt the lessons from 9/11 and other terrorist incidents that had happened around the world. We put in place effective media and communications arrangements to engage with the media, but also to keep the public safe. And we built on those as time has gone by. We've learnt from what happened during July 2005 to ensure that we can provide an effective response, one the United Kingdom was faced with such an unprecedented threat.
And the death of the innocent man, Martin?
Well, I think for Ian Blair, it was something that he never really recovered from. And I think it hung over the Met for a very long time. And it went on, of course, because there was an inquest. There was the police having to deal with the poor man's family. I remember a very senior officer was sent to Brazil, had a very long journey to make contact with John Charles's family. They were paid a lot of money in compensation. But the fact remained that the Met had shot an innocent man, and although in some ways you could understand how it had happened in that very charged atmosphere the day after the failed bombings and the manhunt that was going on, there were some very simple mistakes that were made that perhaps could have avoided it. But something that endeared me to Sir Ian Blair in the wake of the bombings, he was asked in a BBC documentary, what was the first thing you did when you heard about the bombings on 7/7? And he said, I did what everybody else did. I turned on Sky News.
Chris, it's been really wonderful to see you again, particularly after all these years.
Let's
not leave it another few decades. Thank you for coming on True Criminals and being so giving, sharing lots of thoughts and stories from behind the scenes. I think you've given us a real insight in what went on. And despite being involved in a small way, not as much as Martin was, on the reporting of the story, I really feel I've learnt a lot today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helen and Martin.
Hey listeners, your support means everything to us. If you're enjoying the podcast, please take a moment to leave us a review. It helps us grow, reach new listeners, and keep bringing you the stories you love. This episode is brought to you by Audio Bleach Global. Our producer is Russell Barnes, with audio production by Andrew Chappell. The original score was composed by Chap Mannequin, artwork by Bleached, executive produced by Lee Mann. Follow True Criminals on Instagram at true.criminals and on YouTube at youtube.com/@true-criminals. For exclusive content and ways to support the show, visit us at patreon.com/True Criminals. For partnership opportunities, please contact us at contact@audiobleachglobal.com.